Hi, this is Callum from Titans TV, and next to me we have Musa the Moor. What's good?
I'm good, I'm good. I'm there.
Perfect. So today, all right, we're going to be discussing religion and religious journeys. So, my brother, I want to know actually, do you subscribe to religion? And if so, what religion do you subscribe to? And has it been the same religion from the day you came out the womb?
I was born to an Yoruba family. They were Christian. My dad's mum was Muslim, and so there was other religions in my ancestry. But my parents, my mum and dad, were Christian, and you know, I worked with a Christian value system from probably like 0 to about 10, 12 years old. But then there's a point when in school, secondary school, I started questioning religion as far as the images. I went to a Catholic school. The Catholic school had certain imagery that I wasn't particularly comfortable with, because the images didn't look like me. But it was hard to have these type of deep, insightful thoughts, because it was considered taboo to be talking about religious related things, especially if it's challenging the very system that you're born into. My parents, they're not Catholic, but they were they belong to what they call African initiated churches, and the particular branch that my parents belonged to was Celestial Church of Christ, where they wear white.
Whites, yeah.
And then yeah,
with those big,
that's correct. That's correct.
Okay,
that's
okay.
The church. That's
the
the church my parents came from.
Okay.
And this is what they found in Nigeria. You understand? Because
the midnight masses there,
yeah.
Okay.
They came from
6 a.m. in the morning.
Yeah.
Praise and worship.
Like Sunday is Christian day.
Yeah.
It's not like, they go church for 1 hour. They're doing church for the whole day.
Yeah.
That Sunday that's their
sleeping bag ready, meat pie for lunch, everything.
All of that.
Okay.
So that was a big big part of their life. I realized that in Africa unlike here, they take religion very seriously. Like on a Sunday, you ain't gonna see people outside really too tough in a Christian African country. Okay. Because they're in church. If you're in a Muslim African country, you ain't gonna see too much people on a Friday because they're going Jumu'ah prayer.
Yeah.
It's not like in the UK where you belong to a religion but you're not practicing. In Africa, they practice. They take it very serious. So I started to realize that it was hard to bring alternative questions to my parents, because the Christianity that they belonged to or they subscribed to was all they knew. And if you haven't got anything in this world, you've got God. And so it wasn't comfortable for me to question my parents, because it wasn't the done thing in my household.
Yeah.
However, I had the questions inside me that I couldn't vocalize.
Yeah.
So this is where my I can call it anxiety, or maybe something was bothering me, but I couldn't explain to my parents what was bothering me. Okay. It would have been a bit too much, like.
So this all happened roughly around 12 years of age. The years of reasoning, puberty is now kicking in. Yeah. Your mind is starting to think a bit differently.
Yeah.
So tell me, walk me through the process. Okay, you was in that state of mind. You got all of these things. It's bottled up. You must have been quite frustrated. What happened next?
That's where the mischief making, or not giving 100% academically at school came from, because it wasn't that I was a weak student. because I was very capable. I was very able, but I didn't leave school with good grades. I underachieved because of I started to not care about Western education.
Yeah.
Like it wasn't gonna serve me anything. It didn't make any sense. I had questions that I would put forward to like the teacher. I went Roman Catholic school. I put the questions forward to the teacher and so forth, and they would either not know how to answer it, or they would ignore it, or ignore the question or overlook it. Especially when it came to religious studies, and I would see teachers that came from different ethnic backgrounds. Like there was a teacher that was of like Chinese descent. There was a teacher of Indian descent. There was people that looked, black and brown people, and I was thinking, how do you look like that, but you belong to the Catholic faith? It didn't make any sense to me. So it was not something that I was conscious of the time, but me not giving 100% to my school studies was rooted in challenging religious ideas that I felt was hadn't explained itself, and thus it kind of took away my motivation, drive. Like when I started to come late to school, when I wasn't doing my homework, when I didn't put an emphasis on studies or getting top grades, being okay with a C, which is not my style, because I'm very, very I like to master things, and so I know my personality is A. If I'm really interested in something, it's an A or it's nothing.
Love that.
Yeah. So I know I was very able, but I think people of African descent, though they may not be aware of it when they became an adult, if they look back at their school life and they didn't get the grades and do and perform the way they're supposed to, there was underlying issues that was a barrier, a hindrance to why they wasn't performing at secondary school. They did a study that African children or children of African descent, they are very capable and able in their grades from about 0 to 7.
6, 7, yeah.
Yeah. And then after that stage, they start their grades can start to decline depending on what school school they went to afterwards, what crowd they fall into, etc., etc.
Those first years,
Yeah.
they're very, very apt. They're very good at education.
Yeah.
They're even overachieving compared to the rest of their peers.
Yes.
But something happens.
Something then starts to happen where they no longer have grades at the forefront. They're thinking about other things that are not geared towards why they're going to school in the first place, which was to hit the mark. So now I felt my identity was in crisis, but I found an outlet through either cutting class or going into I used to like the arcades as to go places like they had an arcade place down in Elephant Castle, all these games and stuff, and then they had comic book stores in West End, and they had certain news agents or certain stores that were over in the West End. They used to sell manga and anime, and I started to get into all of these different things that weren't related to school and the academic things that a child needs, but the alternative was helping me. Somehow I was identifying with certain characters because it started to make sense to me.
I hear that. So but I would like to know though, in terms of religion though, from growing up in a Christian, Protestant, celestial African church to going to a Catholic school, Roman Catholic school, that must have been tough by itself. Then what was your evolution? Where did you jump to from there?
I was watching. There was a cartoon called Thundercats. I was watching Thundercats. It's in school, before I went to school, I was up very early, as you all are, and they used to have these I used to watch early morning cartoons before I went to school.
6:30 in the morning.
And they used to have this cartoon called Thundercats, and the cartoon to those unassuming, it was laced with all kind of like tradition, custom, magic, sorcery, all kind of things. And there was a particular character in the Thundercats cartoon called Jagger. Have the beard, and he used to have the wand. He knew about all these different spells and all kind of things. I was thinking, somehow I knew what this whole story was trying to explain to me, but obviously they're cats, but they're telling and conveying a story that was reminiscent of where we was coming from, like Africa, because the kind of things that Africans are known to do was this type of stuff: swords, axes, magicians, these type of things. Images was playing in my mind, and I started to think to myself that although Western education wasn't informing me about identity, culture, custom, and so forth, but what I was seeing in terms of subcultures and there was another cartoon there called Brave Star. It's a Native American cartoon. Have you heard of it? It's a Brave Star, and he used to have these like tribal powers.
Okay.
Eyes of the hawk, ears of the wolf, strength of the bear, and there's all of these. He had all these themes.
Yeah.
And I was
sound reminiscent. Okay.
Yeah, my brain was absorbing all of these things. Then they used to have another cartoon there called Defenders of the Earth, and it used to play on certain themes. Again, spirituality, sorcery, magic, very, very important. There was one of the characters in Defenders of the Earth. She knew how to talk to the animals, talk to the cat. And another one was called the Phantom, and he had the strength of 10 tigers. And I was thinking, well, clearly something's happening here, because they're saying something in all of these different things. I'll be there. I'll be absorbing all of these images. I was very conscious of like images and TV. I'll just be watching it. I can go quiet. My parents they're doing other things, they're talking that, but I am so entranced in all of this, like, and it's to do back to back. Because let's say I'm up early, and let's say school starts 9:45. But I'm ready. I'm up at 6. I'm ready for about 6:45, and then I'm just watching a whole like back to back episodes of this, and this, and I'm absorbing all this information. But then I'll go to school. That wouldn't be the subject matter. It would be English, maths, science, and so forth. Sure. But it was the subjects were being taught from separate from culture and heritage. It was just maths. It was just maths and numbers. Yeah. Or science and formulas. But they weren't telling you that the numbers and the formulas have got roots in culture and history. Yeah. They're not telling you that the Moors were masters of algebra and trigonometry. They're not telling you that. They're just telling you their subjects and you're supposed to study. And a lot of people didn't like the subjects that were like science and maths because they was too challenging for the mind. Okay. I remember some of the people in my year, different people that was in school, they weren't too fond of the more challenging subjects. They didn't want to be looked as a geek. So they'd play down their intelligence. They'll dumb themselves down in a way to look cool. They wanted to look cool. They didn't want to be perceived as intelligent. They wanted to look cool, and so being too intelligent would infringe upon their coolness. Yeah. So they would not attempt to be masters of that subjects that important, like the sciences and the maths. And so these kind of things was all kind of connecting in my mind, and it was a deeply like it was creating somewhat of a mental block for me personally, because I wasn't getting the connection to the subjects that I was studying. It wasn't connected to me, except drama. Drama did. Yeah. Subconsciously, because I was able to play out some of the characters that I was watching in the comic book or the cartoon or so forth. I know I could act out those characters, and then I could put on an accent to mimic, the Mumra or the Optimus Prime. That was my way of expression. And music. Now I liked music and playing with the xylophone and the flute and the guitar. For drama and music really spoke to my soul, because it was these arts. Were expressive arts.
That's right.
Then my foundation in creativity, innovation, spirituality started to be shaped. I haven't gone in. Obviously, I'm still developing. I'm still going through the motions of adolescence, and doing all the things that 12-year-old, 13-year-old, 14-year-old would do. But there was also the danger of spiraling out of control. It's these early ages right now where your character's starting to get shaped, and it's gonna put you on a certain trajectory about what direction you're gonna go in with your life, and the kind of person that you're gonna grow up to be. So, with that being said, my parents they didn't communicate with me very well. They communicate with their children very well. They knew they came from a different world, which was Nigeria, and it wasn't the world they immigrated to. Britain wasn't the world they knew, but it's the world that I was born into. Yeah. So there's a bit of a culture clash. The way they do things in the UK is not the way they do things in Nigeria. But they didn't want to give up their Nigerian way of doing things, but they was living in a whole new country, and therein lies the problem. They didn't want to integrate. They wanted to be Yorubas, Nigerians, but in Britain, with the same kind of like characteristics and attitude. Yeah. And so to that extent, it kind of was a clash between two different worlds. There was always trying to tell me how they would do things when they was in Nigeria, and I was always say, well, we're not in Nigeria, we're here. And so they're saying things here which is conflicting with what you're saying. Yeah. So the parents and the teachers weren't in sync either. So now we've got two problems now. Our parents didn't have the ability to articulate their feelings and emotions in an intelligent way to a developing child. And then our parents are saying A and the teacher's saying B. Yeah. A lot of conflict. So where do you understand who's right, who's wrong? See, my parents can't be right and the teacher's wrong, or the teacher's right and my parents wrong, but they're both saying something different, so they can't be both right. Yeah. So somewhere down the line, I got to make a decision. So now, when my parents' ways weren't applicable to the world I was in, so I couldn't listen to them.
Especially when, again, your parents, African Christians, Celestials, right? And then you're going to a Roman Catholic. So one is Protestant. African Christianity is a Protestant form of Christianity. And then you got Roman Catholics or Catholicism. That's two different things anyway. That's conflicting with each other. Yeah. So that's the school era. So what was how did you transition out of the school era? Like what did you cling on to when going to like college years, 16, 17, 18 years of age? What was your transition?
After leaving school, like I got part-time jobs, working in post office and so forth. But these part-time jobs it wasn't my calling. I didn't want to do a 9 to 5, so I didn't keep a 9 to 5. So at that time, so Islam became very popular after about 17, 18. Islam became
Would I say this? If correct me if I'm wrong. Is
Yeah.
this after 2001?
yes, yes. Islam,
Yeah.
Islam became very popular. Remember, I told you that my dad's mum, she was Muslim.
Okay.
Yeah, they were that side of the family were Yoruba Muslims.
Okay.
All right. So it's and it was round about the same time there was a movie that came on, Malcolm X with Denzel Washington. Yeah, but so and I watched it.
Okay.
And I was impressed by the movie.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd recommend anybody to watch that movie. Malcolm X, Denzel Washington plays Malcolm X, and it was the director was Spike Lee.
Spike Lee, yes.
All right, so I watched that movie and I was young, so I started to think like maybe Islam is got something, is the missing link, the thing that I'm looking for that would give me foundation and anchor me in some routine, and I could get some perspective. But I looked at Islam through African American eyes, African American experience.
Yes.
I couldn't go to the Sunni Orthodox mosque and speak like the way I received Islam through looking at Malcolm X. I there was still a kind of I realized that there was different sects within the Islamic world that perceived Islam differently. Anyway, through the African American experience of Islam, I wanted to be a Muslim. I wanted to be a Muslim because Malcolm X had a certain. He was a symbol of strength and pride, and he gave black people something to think about. Especially when they mentioned there was a famous interview that he had, and Malcolm X was asked the question, why do you wear the X after your name? And the answer that he gave, it stuck with me. And he went into something about science. And he said, since the black people don't know their history, they've been cut off from their own culture, their own custom, their own tradition, their own language, their own folklore. Where X in mathematics marks the unknown. So when he said that to me, I said, huh? And the way he would articulate what was going on in his head, I ain't seen it before. I ain't seen no black man do it like that. Denzel Washington is a top actor. He can even act the character better than the character in themselves, but he did it in such a way that it stuck with me. My mind was just ticking. And this is when I started to see black intelligence and the potential of it, because it was a very, very intellectual movie, and the brains was this, the neurons, the motor skills, and everything is just happening in my head, and I'm looking at this. I remember I'm a visual person. I told you I grew up looking at cartoons. I look at comic books. I look at anything that's imagery and patterns and symbols. It would fascinate me. And here I had Malcolm X talking the way he was talking in this movie. And then I started to ask myself, and he went in that movie that he went to Africa. And what's very interesting, he came to Nigeria, and he came to the Yoruba people. The Yoruba people named Malcolm X Omowole. And a lot of people don't know that Malcolm X is a Yoruba name. The Yorubas saw Malcolm X in Nigeria. They said, you come. You are one of us. We're going to call you Omowole. Omowole in Yoruba means the child has returned. The child has come home. They named him Omowole. As much as Malcolm X had an Arabic name called Malik El-Shabazz, he also had a Yoruba name known as Omowole. You understand? If you looked at Malcolm X biography, he will tell you Yoruba name was Omowole. But a lot of people don't know that. They just think, oh, Malcolm X, oh, he's a Muslim, oh, he's a Nation of Islam. And they don't really know much about the Nation of Islam. They just know that he was into something black, and then they had connections with Islam, and then he left Islam and then became Sunni Orthodox. He went to Mecca and he became proper Islam. Orthodox Islam, but he was on a journey of self-discovery. And simultaneously, I was on a journey of self-discovery. So, but these things wasn't people was doing different things in my generation. Some people was following the crowd. Some people was their educational level wasn't that high, or they weren't avid readers. I know I was a person I could when I find something interesting, I can apply. I've got an aptitude for learning, and so because Malcolm X would read books, he inspired me to read books, and so off of the strength of watching the movie, Malcolm X, I got the autobiography of Malcolm X. I started learning about knowledge, history, knowledge of self, the history that black people have been through. But this is all coming from the African American experience. I hadn't really gone into Africa as such. All this information is coming from abroad. African Americans, Caribbeans, because Malcolm X is of Caribbean heritage also.
Canadian descent.
Yeah. And Louis Farrakhan is of West Indian descent.
Yeah.
So I was getting all this information from them. So now it started to shape and color my thinking. I knew that black was important because these were heroic figures in history that told me that they was important. So I would often kind of seek out black orientated thinkers and ask them about what they thought about Malcolm X, or what they thought about Moorish Nation of Islam, or what they thought about Moorish science.
Yeah.
But there wasn't a lot of besides the Rastas, there wasn't too much black people talking black in Britain. But I'll give the Rastas the credit that they was always keeping something black alive.
Yeah.
You understand? I knew that some people's parents back in the day, they were Rasta. And so I knew that there's something about black that the Rastas knew or would talk about that other black people wouldn't talk about. Okay. And so some people, during that time, 2001, 2002, people just converted to Islam. I knew that Islam wasn't the be all and end all, because there's some alternative information that people was talking about, that the Sunni Orthodox mosque wasn't, the imam there didn't mention, or didn't know how to talk about. So as now I'm moving forward now with all this information, I blended science with Islam. This is where I start to see the fascination between the two, because Malcolm X spoke about the X. I know that in algebra, in mathematics, they use X and so forth in order to, when you're trying to work out a formula, trying to work out the unknown. So I mix Islam with science, and then it became Moorish science, and you know, that was another chapter that came out of America, but founded by a man known as Noble Drew Ali, who was African American. But he'd gone to Africa, and then he came back with all this deep knowledge and wisdom. All right, but the UK, Black Britain, was very at that time was very they were uninformed as a group. Certain individuals who were connected knew about these things, but Black Britain as a whole, they were uninformed. And if you said to the average black person in Britain at that time, Noble Drew Ali, they wouldn't know who you're talking about. If you said to the average black British person, Deuce Muhammad Ali, they wouldn't know who you're talking about. If you said to the average black person in Britain, Clarence 13X, they wouldn't know what you're talking about. They knew the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They knew Hamza. They knew Ali. They knew Bilal, the slave that was freed and became, called the first Adan. They knew about what the Quran and the history of Islam was telling them, but they didn't know about these other characters that I'm mentioning, because they were rooted in black history. Understand? Even if it's coming from the Western Hemisphere, it's still rooted in black history. Black Britain was not informed about this because it was an African American experience. The music was carrying a lot of these messages. I used to also listen to Nas, Wu-Tang Clan, and they would be feeding me the information that was reasserting and reconfirming or reaffirming what I was watching on through the Malcolm X movies, etc., etc. So I'm starting to shape my own identity. I'm starting to put things together that was gonna give me the foundation that I needed to move forward. No doubt, I couldn't just bring this information to anyone because it was too alien to them.
So at this age, this is your late teens. You're fusing, Sunni Islam, Nation of Islam, Moorish Science Temple, science together to form your own personal identity.
Yes.
Right? Okay. But I know that wasn't just the end of it. You were still in the process of evolution. You were still growing. You were still changing. Like, what other things impacted you, and where did you go from there?
Afterwards, I must have met. I was told about my own people, the Yoruba. I did a course. I did a course when I was I went to university, but I didn't stick with the degree, and it was called Caribbean Studies. I did Caribbean Studies in History. During that course, it had information regarding Black history from the Caribbean perspective. Before I was in university, I remember I did another course when I was in college, Western or Greek philosophy, and it was talking about things that were from a Western perspective, but had African roots, because a lot of Greeks traveled to Egypt, and so they was inspired by some of the things that they saw in Africa, and then they came back to Greece, and thus they became more enlightened, more sophisticated, more sharper in their ideas. I knew that Greek and Egypt had relation. And many of their famous scholars had traveled to Egypt and knew about the wonders of Egypt and its advanced science, maths, and spirituality. So when I left college, now I went to university and I did Caribbean Studies in History, as I said, and they started to talk about they were Caribbean, but they was talking about how they were taken from Africa to the Caribbean, and they spoke about the transatlantic slave trade, how they were robbed of the knowledge of self and so forth. And then there was a segment of the course, black intelligentsia, when Afro-Caribbean people came out of slavery and started to search for identity, knowledge of self, and how it was very important that there was different groups of blacks formed an identity after slavery over what they could remember. Now, if you're fortunate enough to come from a maroon, the Maroons were rebellious slaves that ran away from the plantation and formed maroon communities and colonies all over the Caribbean, Jamaica, Suriname, Brazil, Puerto Rico, etc. If you're fortunate enough to come from a maroon bloodline, you retain certain information. Maybe you would have known what tribe you came from. Maybe you would have held onto certain tribal religious identity or belief. In Brazil, they had strong Yoruba influence. A lot of the Yorubas were taken to Brazil as slaves. They had a religion there called Candomblé, which dealt with Yoruba religion that was to some degree meshed with Catholicism, but they still kept their Yoruba traditions and customs. and spirits that they called Orishas. I'm getting all of this from blacks that went through transatlantic slave trade. So I'd visited Cuba, and in Cuba they also had a strong Yoruba presence, and they called the same Yoruba religion that they call Candomblé in Brazil. In Cuba they call it Santeria. And I went over there, and it's not like they practice it. It's not like hidden.
Yeah.
They're in Brazil, in Cuba, in places like Brazil, they are practicing it in open. I met them, and it wasn't too long until when I was in Cuba, somebody stepped forward to me, and she was a woman, and she showed me like an altar. She said, "Yeah, they called the priest Santero, and she had, she was doing all these things. It was Yoruba, and so I was finding out. I knew more about Yoruba through not my parents, through the Yorubas that was taken as slaves in Cuba, Brazil, Haiti, Puerto Rico, Trinidad and Tobago. I knew more about the Yoruba from them, not my parents. And my parents are not British. They are Nigerian Yorubas, born in Yoruba land. They knew less about what it was to be. My parents, their first language is not English. Their first language is Yoruba. They speak English badly. That is how thick their accent is.
Yeah.
If they were speaking, sometimes I have to ask them to say that again? Because the way they pronounce certain words is not the way English people pronounce the word. Their intonation, their accent is too thick. Yoruba is their first tongue. They came from a place where in Yoruba land, you didn't wear what I'm wearing now, jeans and a t-shirt and all these things. They're in African attire, cloth. They think they that's the world they come from. The Western influence that came after, long after.
This is amazing though.
Yeah.
To think that we've come full circle, coming from Yoruba land, right, to England, learning nothing about the actual tradition, the culture in terms of the religious spiritual practices, nothing from Yoruba people themselves in the UK, from your parents. You had to go all the way to Cuba, to the Americas, to the Caribbean to learn about self. This is amazing. So from there, you're learning about the Ifa system, the Ifa practices, or are we saying the Candomblé?
Candomblé.
Santeria. We're learning these things. This is indigenous to Yoruba.
Yeah.
Talk to me. What was going on from there?
I was fascinated by it because I knew it was dealing with ancestry, it's dealing with roots, it's dealing with history. I knew there was people in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas, that was telling me that the Yoruba originated from the Sudan, which is Black Egypt. I did the history, and I realized, I confirmed it to be true. Yorubas came from the Sudan. They came from the Nile Valley regions, and they came and they settled in southwest Nigeria. So, knowing that the Yorubas came from Kemet, I knew that the Yorubas possessed something that a lot of other tribal groups in Africa didn't have. Either they lost it through war, invasions, or they converted to other religious beliefs like Islam or Christianity, but the Yorubas retained a lot of information during the colonial period and the transatlantic slave period that was fascinating. Remember I said to you, when Africans in the Western Hemisphere start to look for knowledge of self after slavery, it was about what you could remember. Yeah. The reason why voodoo is so powerful in Haiti, because it was what the Haitians held on to, and Haiti, Brazil, and Cuba was these were some of the last regions in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery.
Yeah.
Late.
Late.
Like we're talking like almost like 1900s.
But you know what? Before you continue on that point, you said a term which is, I'm sure many of the people listening in right now may not know or heard of this term. You made mention of a term called Kemet. What is that?
Kemet was just the word that the native Egyptians used to describe their land.
Okay.
Yeah, in their tongue they called it Kemet, and then later on, it adopted the name Egypt.
Okay.
But Kemet was just the native tongue of the indigenous people of that land.
So you're saying that these Kemet people are also related to the Yoruba people?
Yes.
Okay.
Even in Europe, Yoruba's got their own traditional medicine. Mm-hmm. Their medicine refers to Kemetic sciences. The Yorubas have got you've heard of the chakra system?
Yeah.
Like the Hindus speak about.
Yeah.
The Yorubas have got their chakra system. 7 chakras of, the body, human body in Yoruba traditional medicine.
Okay.
So it's going back many years of tribal medicine, herbal practices, and spiritual sciences. That what the Yoruba culture was passed on from father to son, mother to daughter. They didn't have writing. The Yoruba was a tribe that did not write, which would later on lead to their downfall, because they was up against other nations that were literate,
Yeah.
like the French, the English, the Portuguese, the Spanish, and even the Arabs and the Turks. But those societies were written, so they knew about the recording. But when the Yorubas were faced with other nations that either traded with them or started to encroach on their land, they couldn't keep up with the written word, what they call which was later become what you call the printing press. So the Yorubas, to a degree, they felt either they were gonna be outdated, or they start to find favor in new religious beliefs that was given to them by either the Arabs or Islam or the Europeans and Christianity. Okay. And so this is where modernization started to take place, and Yoruba religion started to be perceived as old-fashioned, outdated, or without need in the modern world. It was moving into a new age. You see what I'm saying to you? So for identity and for connection, cultural protection, the Yorubas that were taken as slaves were forced to hold on to their beliefs as a sense of pride and resistance, because there was during the slave period, they were getting oppressed, exploited, beaten, killed by their master, who was of European descent. And in order to identify with something that gave them pride, they found strength in the Yoruba religion. Though they called it Candomblé in Brazil, or they called it Santeria in Cuba, or they called it voodoo in Haiti, or they called another black religion there Abuqua. There's another one called Abuqua. There's another black religion called Palamayombe. There's another black religion called Makumba. Some of them came from the Congo tribes, or Igbo tribe, or so forth. But they was a need for black religious spiritual identity, for guidance and protection, because they came from the plantocracy was a hostile world, and you needed to have something to give you strength and protection and confidence. You understand? Mm-hmm. So yes, the Americas, more importantly, the South, Central, and the Caribbean held on to black religion very, very seriously, very, very strong connection with African ancestral roots and heritage. There was blacks that were Muslim, but again, it was Islam from an African perspective where they mixed it with tradition. It was never just Islam, go to the mosque and then go home. It was Islam. They pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then they took a liquid or a drink and they poured something out for the ancestors.
Libation.
They did libation.
Right.
They was into something mystical.
Yeah.
It weren't just like Islam the way you see someone from maybe Bangladesh background or Pakistan background. It wasn't just like that. And then, you just went to. There was a history there because some of these Muslims, they were coming from Mali. They were coming from Kenimbono. They were Bambara. They were Mandinka. They were Hausa. They were Fulani. So they came from a tribal tradition and heritage where you did things a certain way.
Yeah.
All right.
So now we've gone on a nice long journey from growing up in a Protestant African Christian household to going to a Roman Catholic school to, going through that process of trying to find oneself, finding Islam, going through Moorish Science Temple, Nation of Islam, finding yourself back into Yoruba tradition and culture. Are you saying, was there a further evolution into Kemet, or are we staying on Ifa? Is there more to go?
There was more to go. The further evolution into Egypt, into Kemet. Was
before you go any further, I want to know, is there still more to go after Kemet? Or is Kemet home?
Kemet was home.
Kemet was home.
Kemet was home because it was just completing the migration.
Okay.
The Yorubas came from the Sudan to Nigeria.
So you went right back to the roots.
Right back to the root.
Okay.
Which was the Sudan.
All right.
So and I saw ancient Egypt. Remember, Egypt and Sudan is one landmass before invaders came and put the line, start to put up borders. Egypt and Sudan is I want people to fully understand this. The way Africa looks today is not how Africa looked before invasion.
Okay.
It was one landmass, and tribes moved around. See, they tried to give you the impression that the Igbo was just there, one place, or the Yoruba was just in one place, or the Ashanti was just in one place. They moved around. I remember a history teacher told me that the Zulus in South Africa don't originally come from there. That they came from East Africa, and then they went to the West or Central, and then they moved down to the South, and they settled there, and then it became Zululand. You think about the Zulus, they tend to be a bit more militant than their other tribal neighbors. They're famous for fighting, but they're not necessarily native to Southern Africa, but they came via migrations. So I want to say that the tribes moved around, and it's very important to realize this because it helps see the continent of Africa through new perspective, new understanding. And so there's a famous African scholar called Sheikh Anta Diop. He was of Senegalese descent, and he had wrote that the Yorubas was the closest tribal, religious, spiritual people after the fall of Kemet. They retained the closest in Egyptian mysticism and spirituality after Egypt had fell, because it had priest and priestess, it had spirits that were both gender, male and feminine. It had the way you'd have the ancient Egyptians would set up their practices and so forth is the way that the Yorubas would set up their practices and so forth. When people saw the Yoruba. They just saw mini Egypt. They wasn't as strong as the ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt was superpower, but they retained a lot of things orally. The Yorubas didn't write. They didn't have the hieroglyphics and so forth, but they had the practices that were reminiscent of Egypt. Even there's a Yoruba goddess called Yemenya, and they have another goddess of the Nile called Spirit of the Nile, or called Yemunya or Moyat, or something similar to Yemenya in phonetics. So they had similar concepts. The Yorubas set up their civilization around rivers. The Niger River runs through Yoruba land. Yeah. All right. Egypt and Sudan set their civilization up in around the Nile. And the river was very spiritual and mystical to them. In the Yoruba land, the rivers and it's very spiritual and mystical to them, profound. I mean, the stories that you hear regarding the waters that run through Yoruba land is people have been known to see things, have visions, all kind of mystical things like in Yoruba land, nature is alive, both physical and spiritual. Encounters that you don't hear about in your Western lifestyle, you would hear it from Yoruba land. Awesome. I'm talking from shape shifting to seeing spirits, having dreams that you don't know, like in Western Hemisphere, in France or in Belgium, you wouldn't get. It would happen in Nigeria. It would happen in the Sudan. It would happen. Mystical things happening to people. So I knew, because people had written about it. I remember I was doing Caribbean studies and in history, and some people had left stories about some of the things that happened to them, and then he asked them, so where, how do you know how to do these type of spiritual things? And they said, yeah, it all come from Africa. Yeah. There was the Maroons many of them was of Ghanaian and Ashanti heritage. They talked about similar type of experiences, mystical things taking place. It was all connected to Africa. So yes, the full circle came back to Egypt via the Sudan, and to me, the pharaonic black Egyptians perfected the highest form of civilization on the African soil, and the pyramids of famous pyramids of Giza was testament to that.
Definitely. Well, that's a perfect closing statement to be said of the journey of Musa, from the migration from Yoruba land, Nigeria, to the UK, all the way over into the Caribbeans and in the Americas, and then all the way back home to Kemet. Musa, it's been an absolute pleasure listening to your story and hearing your journey. And this concludes the first segment of this podcast.